What if I told you that in 1731, New York faced an enemy it could not see, yet feared in every breath? Welcome to Robert's History. I am Robert, and today I invite you to step back into a chapter of American history that still echoes with quiet sorrow. The visuals in this video are symbolic and may not perfectly match every detail, and I truly appreciate your understanding. If you value reflective history, please consider subscribing for future journeys. I wish you a nostalgic and peaceful viewing experience. In the year 1731, New York was still a young city, but it was already alive with movement. Ships crowded its harbor, carrying goods, sailors, merchants, and families searching for opportunity. Along the narrow streets near the docks, markets buzzed and taverns filled with conversation. It felt like a place rising toward promise. Yet that same harbor, the pride of the city, also opened the door to something far more dangerous. Smallpox arrived not with cannon fire or warning bells, but quietly carried from ship to shore. The Variola virus moved through breath and touch, passing from neighbor to neighbor before anyone fully understood what was happening. For many New Yorkers in 1731, the first sign was a sudden fever in someone they knew. Within days, fear spread faster than the illness itself. This was the invisible executioner of the 18th century. Families watched anxiously, unsure who would fall next. The bustling port city began to feel smaller, heavier, as uncertainty settled over homes and streets. In 1731, New York faced an enemy it could not see, and that quiet terror changed the city forever. To understand what New York faced in 1731, we need to understand the virus itself. Smallpox was caused by the Variola virus, one of the most lethal infectious agents in human history. This was not a seasonal sickness or a passing fever. It was an acute viral disease that attacked the entire body with terrifying efficiency. Once inside a person, it multiplied quickly, overwhelming the immune system before medicine had any real tools to stop it. Variola spread primarily through respiratory droplets. A simple conversation, a shared room, a cough in a crowded space could be enough. It could also spread through direct contact with contaminated clothing or bedding. In a port city like colonial New York, where sailors, dock workers, merchants, and families lived in close quarters, this made containment incredibly difficult. Ships arriving from overseas did not just carry cargo. They carried microbes invisible to the eye. The mortality rate was staggering. Historians and medical records consistently estimate that about 30% of those infected died. In practical terms, that meant nearly 1 in 3 people who developed the disease would not survive. For a small and growing city, that number was not abstract. It meant neighbors, children, church members, and business partners. New York in 1731 was tightly knit and densely settled near the waterfront. Homes were close together, sanitation was limited, and knowledge of viral transmission did not yet exist. In that environment, the Variola virus did what it had done for centuries. It moved silently through human networks, turning the energy of a thriving port into the perfect pathway for outbreak. For the people of New York in 1731, smallpox was not just a statistic or a distant rumor. It was something they saw unfold inside their own homes. The illness often began suddenly. A healthy person could wake with a high fever, chills, and a crushing exhaustion that felt far worse than an ordinary sickness. Many sufferers described intense back pain, so severe that even sitting upright became difficult. At that stage, families might still hope it was something less dangerous. Within days, that hope usually faded. The defining sign of smallpox soon followed. A rash appeared, first as small red spots, then transforming into raised blisters filled with fluid and eventually thick pus. These lesions spread across the face, arms, torso, and legs. They were not mild irritations. They were deep, painful eruptions embedded in the skin. Contemporary medical descriptions confirm that the discomfort could be relentless. Eating, sleeping, even resting against fabric could cause agony. As the pustules matured, the face often became swollen and unrecognizable. Eyelids could swell shut. Some patients developed lesions in their eyes, which sometimes led to permanent blindness. For survivors, recovery did not mean restoration. When the scabs finally fell away, they frequently left deep-pitted scars that marked a person for life. In a close-knit colonial community, those scars were visible reminders of both survival and loss. For many others, the disease progressed toward a far more tragic outcome. The fever could intensify. Dehydration and secondary infections could set in. Without modern supportive care, the body simply failed. Death was often slow, occurring after days or weeks of escalating suffering. Families in 1731 New York sat beside bedsides with little they could do but wait and pray. When we look back, it is important to remain factual and clear. Smallpox was brutal, but its course followed patterns documented by physicians of the time and later historians. The horror was not exaggerated. It lay in the predictability of the symptoms and the helplessness people felt as they watched them unfold. In 1731, the sight of a spreading rash in a loved one was enough to fill a household with dread, because everyone understood what usually came next. As smallpox tightened its grip in 1731, New York was no longer just a port city chasing opportunity. It became a city holding its breath. Panic did not erupt all at once, but it spread steadily as more households reported illness. Church bells rang more often for funerals. Neighbors who once greeted each other in narrow streets began to keep their distance. Fear moved through the community as surely as the virus itself. Families faced painful separations. When someone showed clear signs of infection, isolation became the only known response. Loved ones were sometimes kept apart within the same home or removed to prevent further spread. For a society built on close family ties and shared labor, this was emotionally devastating. Parents worried for children. Spouses watched one another for symptoms. The uncertainty was constant and deeply personal. Commerce, the lifeblood of colonial New York, began to slow. Ships still arrived, but suspicion surrounded every vessel. Dockworkers hesitated. Merchants feared contaminated goods or sick crew members. Markets thinned as people avoided crowded spaces. In a city whose prosperity depended on trade across the Atlantic, even a temporary disruption carried serious consequences. Income stalled, supplies fluctuated, confidence weakened. The workforce shrank as illness and death removed laborers, artisans, and sailors from daily life. Workshops could not function at full capacity. Construction slowed. Routine services became unreliable. Each absence rippled outward, affecting families who depended on steady wages. For a growing colonial city, this loss of manpower was not abstract. It was visible in quiet storefronts and unfinished work. Psychologically, the strain was immense. People did not yet understand viruses or immunity the way we do today. They understood patterns of contagion through experience, and that experience taught them to fear proximity. Social gatherings declined. Public life narrowed. The harbor, once a symbol of connection and growth, felt like a point of vulnerability. When we look back at New York in 1731, we are not just studying a medical episode. We are seeing how quickly a thriving American city could be shaken at its foundations. The crisis exposed how interconnected daily life had become. It also revealed how fragile that stability was when confronted with an unseen biological threat. In 1731, New York had no modern medicine to rely on. There was no widely available vaccine, no antiviral treatment, no scientific understanding of germs. Edward Jenner's breakthrough with vaccination would not come until decades later. City officials and physicians were working with limited knowledge and even fewer tools. Faced with a disease that killed nearly a third of those infected, they turned to the only strategy that seemed possible: quarantine. Isolation was not a gentle measure. Homes with infected residents were often marked and avoided. Movement was restricted when illness was suspected. Ships arriving in port could be delayed or monitored more closely. The goal was simple in theory, to separate the sick from the healthy and slow the chain of transmission. In practice, it was painful and imperfect. For families, quarantine meant separation at the moment they most wanted to be together. For merchants and sailors, it meant lost income and stalled opportunity. For officials, it meant making decisions that could anger citizens, yet still fail to stop the spread. You can sense the desperation in historical records. Leaders were trying to preserve both life and order in a city that felt increasingly unstable. Psychologically, quarantine deepened the fear already present. Closed doors and quiet streets became daily reminders that something was wrong. Trust in neighbors was tested. At the same time, these measures represented a form of collective responsibility. Even without modern science, people understood that limiting contact could limit danger. It was a harsh response. But in 1731, it was the only weapon New York had. The crisis of 1731 was not the end of the story. Smallpox would continue to haunt New York and the wider world for generations. Real change began later in the 18th century when Edward Jenner introduced the first successful smallpox vaccine in 1796. His work built on earlier practices of inoculation and offered something revolutionary for its time. For the first time, humanity had a reliable method to prevent the disease rather than simply endure it. Over the next 2 centuries, vaccinations slowly reshaped public health. In the United States, mass immunization campaigns became a defining feature of modern medicine. What began as a risky experiment evolved into coordinated national and eventually global efforts. In the 20th century, the World Health Organization launched an unprecedented worldwide vaccination campaign. Teams traveled across continents, reaching cities, villages, and remote communities with a clear objective: stop transmission everywhere. In 1980, the World Health Organization officially declared smallpox eradicated. It remains the only human disease to be completely eliminated through vaccination. For a virus that once killed millions and terrified cities like New York in 1731, this was an extraordinary victory. It stands as one of the greatest achievements in medical history. Yet the story carries a sober reminder. The Variola virus has not entirely disappeared. Official samples are still stored under high security at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States and at the Vector Institute in Russia. These repositories exist for research and preparedness, but their presence also raises concerns about biosecurity and the potential misuse of such a pathogen. When we look back at New York in 1731, we see vulnerability and fear. When we look at 1980, we see cooperation and scientific triumph. The lesson is not just about a virus. It is about responsibility. The same species that once trembled before smallpox ultimately defeated it. Remembering that journey helps us understand both the fragility and the strength of our society. The year 1731 was not simply a season of illness. It was a time when ordinary people in New York faced mass death with very little protection. About 30% of those infected did not survive. Those who did often carried deep scars for the rest of their lives. The city slowed under fear and quarantine, its streets quieter, its spirit shaken. Yet in the long arc of history, science prevailed and smallpox was defeated. As I reflect on this story, I am reminded how fragile and resilient we are at the same time. The images in this video were created with artificial intelligence to help visualize the narrative, and I appreciate your understanding. I would truly value your thoughts in the comments. And if this journey moved you, please consider subscribing to continue exploring history together.